Odysseus the Sophist. On the birth of philosophy from the spirit of travel stress. Part 1. Polytropos, the man of twists and turns. Anyone who uses the word odyssey nowadays generally means nothing more than wandering around. Such wandering can lead to a safe and sound homecoming, thus the comfortable and circumspect way of thinking, which does not wish to hear about roaming around unless the story ends with the reminder that there is no place like home. But wandering around can lead to distant horizons, and this corresponds to the modern sensibility that generally mistrusts arrivals and praises those who keep going, because all places seem in principle to be equally good or bad. Thus I can tell whether you are a conservative or a modern if you tell me whether you prefer for an odyssey to end at home, or whether the name Ithaca only refers to a stage on a journey that continues further to a familiar destination or to parts unknown. If we open the Odyssey, attributed to a poet by the name of Homer, who is supposed to be the same person responsible for the Iliad, a book about the rage of Achilles and the fall of Troy, and simply reading it will convince us that its famous stories of wandering have merely an episodic function. They constitute just 4 of the 24 books that form the corpus of Odysseus's tale, although this way of arranging the text was a late addition by an Alexandrine or editor. The other 20 books have a single theme: how it could happen that Odysseus, the man who for a long time could not find his way back from Asia Minor to Ithaca, still finally arrived back home after a 20-year absence, by the will of the gods and in keeping with his own heartfelt desire. Thus any actual reader of the Odyssey, or better, any listener who allows him or herself to be enchanted by the rhapsodic recital as though at a concert, will be quite certain that it is a story of coming back home after a war, even more, an apotheosis of the return to domesticity. What the Odyssey celebrates in 20 of its 24 books is the ability to put a monstrous 10-year war on foreign soil behind one, and then suffer 10 years of nautical and erotic catastrophe on various islands and at sea, and yet be able to once more become a Greek among one's own kind at the end, a friend among friends, a man of the house with his wife, in a word, a man who returns home to peace. Only in this way is the story structured in a decidedly Ithaca-centric manner. And this was the only way to convince all post-Homeric generations of Greeks, initially listeners but later readers of the songs too, that a Greek is someone who succeeds in returning from a foreign war to once more devote himself to the binding powers and dynamic vital energies that are to be found in a place of his home, and even to the tragedies that not seldom follow the homecoming. In short, even today when we open the Odyssey, we read the greatest story of re-civilization in Western literature. It provides an answer to the existential question of Greek culture: is there life after the Trojan War? It can affirm that there is, by showing how the process of the hero's return home tends to end up subtly disarming the heroes, along with tragic local politics and endless dramas having to do with relationships. So, let us turn to the much-read beginning of the Odyssey once again, and listen to how the singer provides a framework and perspective for his subject matter. Sing in me, muse, and through me tell the story of that man skilled in all ways of contending, the wanderer, harried for years on end after he plundered the stronghold on the proud height of Troy. He saw the townlands and learned the minds of many distant men, and weathered many bitter nights and days, in his deep heart at sea, while he fought only to save his life, to bring his shipmates home. And when long years and seasons wheeling brought him around that point of time, ordained for him to make his passage homeward. Trials and dangers even so attended him, even in Ithaca, near those he loved. We have said enough for now about the epic plot. In fact, the Odyssey, from the 13th up to the 24th and final book, only recounts the details of Odysseus' difficulties after he returns to Ithaca. He has come home and yet is far from reclaiming his property. In his formerly wealthy home, a host of parasites have established themselves and gotten used to enjoying the delights of a freeloading life. In some ways, comparable here to a modern society of those who live off the interest from their trust funds while devoting themselves to amusements. The homecoming hero must avoid their murderous intentions, and the former ruler of Ithaca must match his own sense of wounded honour, which must be made right against their exploitative impudence, even if the price to be paid is a massacre. The epithet that first provides a closer description of the story's hero is key to the issue under consideration. We find the first instance of Odysseus' name in the 48th verse, yet the first verse already introduces its winged epithet, Polytropos, a word whose adequate translation has racked the brains of Hellenists and Homeric experts since the Roman era. Livius Andronicus, whose rather loose translation, Odusia, inaugurated Roman literature around 200 BCE, decided on the Latin expression virum versatum, translation, well-versed man. In 1781, Voss, for a long time the most successful of the German translators of Homer, rendered it in a philologically faithful manner as de vielgewanderte, translation, he who has wandered much. The translation used above by Robert Fitzgerald from 1963 uses that man skilled in all ways of contending. Earlier English Hellenists used expressions such as much travelled or crafty for this passage, while more recent ones, providing a free poetic rendering, such as Robert Fagel's The Man of Twists and Turns. The French poet Lecomte de Lisle adapts Polytropos in his translation of the Odyssey from 1861 with, and again I apologise for my lack of French here, Le homme subtil qui era si longtemps, which is unquestionably quite a stretch from the spirit of the original. Ippolito Piedemonte, the author of the classic Italian translation, renders the critical passage with the phrase l'ero multiforme che tanto vago. I have no more Italian than French, obviously. If we realise that Homeric epithets are the soul of rhapsodic movement, we know that translating them is anything but a minor issue. Just as Hegel will later speak of the labour of the concept, so must we speak of the labour of the epithet in the world of Homeric formulation. On this critical question, I believe that we should award first prize to the translation of Old Voss, with second prize going to Robert Fagles, who caused a furore in 1990 with his new translation of the Odyssey, in which he risked breaking up Homer's epithet too much with his in twists and turns, harming the authentic rhapsodic tone quite a bit, which requires the eternal return of concise stock phrases. Anyone wishing to know who Odysseus is must start with the fact that from the very first line he is Polytropos, the man of many paths. He who has been put to the test by his detours, a sufferer of setbacks, someone who has been storm-tossed, a man who is played with in many ways and yet who always manages to ensure that the moves made by circumstance ultimately lead to a single result on which everything hinges, the completion of his return home. Because his difficulties in returning home can be traced back to a divine grudge, his wanderings are to be understood as a punishment. They are not an endless sentence, but rather an assignment that he can complete in a certain amount of time with the assistance of Athena and a good deal of his own ingenuity. Thus, 10 years of divinely sent obstacles are added to 10 years of absence caused by war. A large part of the second decade is spent by the hero on 2 different islands under the spell of women who are skilled in magic. First with Calypso, who demands 7 years of love bondage in her grotto, and then with Circe, who claims an additional year for herself and her marvellous bed. The shorter part of the journey's time is spent in actual seafaring, facing storms, shipwreck, and the famous adventures with the oblivious Lotus Eaters, the one-eyed man-eater Polyphemus, and the eccentric Lystragonian giants. And finally the fairy tale-like friendly Phaeacians, to whom he relates his adventures one long evening as a thanks for their hospitality, the Odyssey within the Odyssey. The Polytropos is thus the hero of delayed movement toward a goal. This predestines him for all manner of metaphorical reinterpretation and spiritual appropriation, since Odysseus is directly or indirectly a factor any time the structure of the complicated return voyage is taken up again in later European culture. For early Christians, paradise is an Ithaca of the soul. For Augustine, the human heart is always restless and is storm-tossed by exercises until it finds rest in God. While in Novalis, the correct romantic answer to the question, where are we going, is always back home. And even for Hegel, the Odyssey is a symbol of spirit's journey around the world, which after its long exile and externality finally returns as the reflective arrival of the idea at home with itself. As Polytropos, Odysseus is a man who is stretched on the rack of delay. Hence his manoeuvrability is only the flip side of his constant suffering. In truth, he is a passion hero, a man of sorrows who encounters obstacles on his return home, even when circumstances seem to ensure that his delays are enjoyable. He is not just a passion hero when he is tossed about in the floods sent by Poseidon, which lasts for days, with death seemingly right around the corner, or when barbarians eat his travelling companions while they are still alive. He is also one when he takes a year off to rest in the arms of the nymph Calypso. As the goddess's nightly lover, he sits on the shore of the island of Ogygia by day and weeps bitter tears, feeling homesick. He heroically perseveres in sleeping with the goddess, of course, but his heart is not really in it, since his home and his wife are always on his mind. He only analogically shares a bed with another woman, insofar as she is a respectable surrogate for his wife. He agrees to pay tribute to femininity at another point, since from his distinctly faithful perspective, every attractive woman is more or less created in the image of Penelope. Thus he can never be entirely unfaithful when he is attracted to other women. Travelling around the world has its price. But since Odysseus's love, in the final analysis, is bound to his native soil, Patrida Gaia, and to his marital furrow, he must be disappointed by every woman that makes him weak in the knees, but cannot provide him with the great feeling of finally arriving home and seeing his own herds in the fields when the wandering traveller comes back for his own. Even the incredibly voluptuous Circe finds this out and has every reason to say to the reluctant hero, "Hale must your heart be, and your tempered will. Odysseus, then, you are, O great contender." We again hear the key word, Polytropos, which characterises the heroes being tossed back and forth. Odysseus climbs into the bed of the witch of Iaea, after she makes a solemn vow to not harm him. Otherwise he would have to fear that, "Now it is I myself you hold, enticing, into your chamber, to your dangerous bed, to take my manhood when you have me stripped." After Circe's pledge, he is nevertheless ready to give it a try, even if the homecoming temporarily fades from view here. The much-wandering hero's frequent movement even includes an encounter with his own epic shadow. Odysseus undergoes a primal staging of the encounter with the self, indeed of self-reflection, near the halfway point of his journey, when he attends a banquet at the court of the Phaeacian king Alcinous, where the blind rhapsody Demodocus, whose name literally means honoured by the people, performs in the midst of the festivities. Incredibly, Demodocus sings of the very events in the war from which our hero has escaped not long before. At the Phaeacian king's table, Odysseus hears the song of the fall of Troy, and of the unspeakable suffering of the heroes who died there. Indeed, he even hears the story of the Trojan horse and the sack of the city. This is more than he can bear, and he loses his composure. To conceal his distress, he draws a veil over his face and freely weeps tears that his host cannot see. And Odysseus let the bright molten tears run down his cheeks, weeping the way a wife mourns for her lord, on the lost field where he has gone down fighting. In this moment of emotional reflection, he first fully becomes Polytropos, a man who got around so much that he had to stumble across the reflections of his own past. Here, reflexivity emerges from maneuverability. An encounter with the self emerges from being tossed about. In this staging of subjective memory, the oldest in European literature, the epic reunion with his own fate still initially seems to be a superficial coincidence. And yet here memory is already linked to emotional pain. Centuries before tragedy and millennia before psychoanalysis. Catharsis immediately follows anamnesis. If even tears must somehow be learned, then we could say that Europe has learned a beneficial kind of crying from Odysseus, and first realized how stories and tears belong together by observing him, a storm-tossed man. Of course, Odysseus weeps to himself over everything that has happened, everything in which he was actively involved and everything that he suffered, and sheds ecumenical tears for friend and foe alike. Many centuries later, Virgil still adheres to this principle that depiction and storytelling renew pain. When he has the Roman Odysseus, Aeneas, a refugee who is on his way from old Troy in the east to Rome, the new Troy in the west, encounter ornate images that immortalize the Trojan catastrophe, shortly after landing on the coast of Carthage, images before which he stands stunned, sighing often the while, and his face wet with a full river of tears. Though in convulsions Aeneas manages to say, "Sunt lacrimae rerum et mentem mortalia tangont." Even things themselves have their tears, and mortal fates touch the soul. Virgil provides a formula for how the realist art of narration functions in Aeneas's subsequent telling of the story to Dido, when it occurs to the hero to say to the listener, "Infandum regina, iubis renovare dolorem," or, "Dreadful, O Queen, is the woe thou bidst me recall." Theodore Haker probably right when he remarked that Virgil here managed to write one of the most sonorous lines of all time, with 5 of the most ordinary words in Latin.